Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you have never seen my face before, then hi, my name's Molly, if you hadn't just guessed that. And I post true crime videos like this every single week, so if that's something that you think you might want to stick around for, then definitely subscribe. In today's video, we are going to be talking about the boy in the box, who is also known as America's Unknown Child. This case was actually suggested to me by Catherine, one of my Patreon members, so thank you so much, Catherine. I had heard of this case before, but I didn't really know too much information about it, but it is a crazy case. There are a few theories, and I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on it in the comments. Quickly, before I get into it, I just want to clarify that my intent with these videos is never to offend or upset anyone that may have been involved with the case. Everything that I've collected for this video has been from several different sources online, all of which are linked in the description box. And having said all of that, let's just get into this case. So this case took place in Fox Chase, which is a neighborhood in northeast Philadelphia in the US. It was the 23rd of February 1957 when, in the early evening, a young college student named Frederick Benoit decided to go for a hike in the woods just off of Susquehanna Road in the Fox Chase district. I'm sorry, I'm probably not pronouncing that right. Although Frederick wasn't just going for like an innocent walk, nearby there was actually a place called the Good Shepherd Home, and this was a school for like troubled young women. It was Frederick's plan to walk there and just watch these young girls, and this was something that he had done before. He was actually a peeping Tom, and this was one of his regular spots. However, whilst he was on his way there, Frederick said that he saw a rabbit running along the highway, and he was aware of the fact that there were like rabbit and animal traps in the area, and so he decided to go and check if this rabbit was safe and look for these animal traps. I don't know, maybe he was planning on getting rid of them. So he was just like looking through the area looking for these animal traps, and he came across a cardboard box in the woods, and he was curious, so he decided to look inside of it, and when he did, he saw the dead body of a young child. Now, Frederick wasn't actually the first person to find this corpse. Another man, a muskrat hunter, who actually put down some of the animal traps that Frederick was trying to find, came across the discovery of the body a few days earlier than Frederick. This other young man, whose name I don't actually know, I don't believe it's public information, he was in the area a few days before Frederick, and he was kind of checking on his traps because, like I said, he did put down some of the traps, and so he was checking them when he came across the same body in the cardboard box, and he decided not to tell the authorities because he was worried that if he did, he would have to tell the police why he was there in the first place, and he thought that he would get in trouble for setting these animal traps. And so instead he just decided to ignore this body and just carry on. And then a few days after this, Frederick came across the body, and he was actually planning on doing the same thing as the first boy. He wasn't going to tell the police either, because obviously he was in the woods to go and peep on the young girls in the nearby school, and so he was worried that if he told the police, he would also get in trouble. But Frederick's conscience got the better of him, and so the following day he confessed to a priest about what he had seen, and this priest told him that he needed to do the right thing and tell the police, and so that's exactly what he did the next day. Initially, Frederick told the police that he was just there that day to check that the rabbits were safe, but eventually he did confess and say the real reason that he was there was to spy on the girls at the nearby school. And just as a side note, Frederick did actually do a lie detector test because obviously he appeared quite suspicious, and the police thought that maybe he had something to do with this body in the cardboard box in the woods, but he actually passed this lie detector test and he was eventually ruled out as having anything to do with it. Although I'm not entirely sure what happened with the other man who came across the body a few days before Frederick, because the police did eventually find out about him, and I don't know what happened there, so I'm guessing he was also eventually ruled out. But anyway, the police went to the area where Frederick said he saw this corpse, and sure enough, the police found the dead body of a young boy inside a cardboard box, which was was believed to be the boy's like makeshift coffin. The young boy was completely naked, but he had been wrapped in a blanket, and then someone obviously put his body in this cardboard box and just left it in the woods. So the body was taken for an autopsy, and this determined that this young boy was most likely between the ages of 3 and 7 years old. He was measured at 41 inches and weighed just 30 pounds. The coroner stated that he was very malnourished and he hadn't eaten much before his death. The coroner also determined that this boy had blue eyes and either blonde or light brown hair. The sources vary, but most sources say that he had blonde hair, although his hair was matted, and someone had actually attempted to cut it very recently, but not very well because clumps of his hair were still like clinging to his body. The boy had a fair complexion and his nails were also neatly trimmed, but he did, however, have a lot of bruises and scars pretty much all over his body, and some of these appear to be like surgical scars. He had one near his groin, possibly from a hernia operation, another scar on the left side of his chest, another on his ankle, and another one under his chin, which looked as though it was shaped like the letter L. It was also found that the boy had probably had eye treatment recently because there was dye in his eye which was used to treat eye problems. The cause of this boy's death was believed to have been from trauma to the head, possibly caused by a blunt object. So someone had hit him over the head with something several times, resulting in his death. Like I mentioned earlier, there was bruising pretty much all over him, but mainly on the left side of his body, and these bruises were quite fresh, indicating that he had been badly beaten before his death. And the victim's body also showed signs of having been submerged in water either shortly before or shortly after his death, because his hands and his feet were wrinkled. His esophagus also contained like a dark browny residue which was believed to have been vomit, so it's believed that he was probably sick shortly before his death. And it was concluded that this boy had been lying dead in this cardboard box for anywhere between 3 days and 2 to 3 weeks, so no one knows exactly how long he was there for. It was clear to the police that this little boy had been murdered and then someone had just dumped his body, and so an investigation into his death began on the 26th of February 1957, and they took his fingerprints hoping that someone would come forward and report their child missing and they would be able to make a connection. However, no match was made. Luckily, the boy's body wasn't too badly decomposed, and so the police took photos of his face and they released these photos to the public in the hopes that someone would come forward and recognize him. So these pictures were released and they literally became so famous, and over the next few years more than 400,000 flyers of this boy's face were sent out everywhere in Philadelphia and other towns in Pennsylvania. These pictures of the boy were posted in gas stations and police stations and post offices. They were even put into the envelopes with people's gas bills. This case gained so much attention in the area, and yet the police received very little information from the public, which they really didn't expect. The police thought at the start of this investigation that they would be able to identify this boy pretty quickly, because who doesn't realise that their child is missing? But no one really recognised this boy or came forward with any information. Now, the police found a few items near this boy's body, including a blue boy's cap, a child's scarf, and a handkerchief with the initial G on it. And so the police collected up these items because they thought maybe they belonged to the child, or maybe they belonged to the person who dumped this child's body. However, none of these items really brought forward any new leads. And something else that the police also did was they dressed this boy's dead body in some clothes and they put him in like a seated position, and they took pictures of him to apparently show what he would have looked like when he was alive. I think that they thought that if maybe people didn't recognise this picture of his face when he was dead, if they tried to make it appear as though he was alive, someone may recognize him. Although to me, this picture of him like dressed up and positioned doesn't look like he's alive. It just looks really creepy. But anyway, these pictures were taken and they were also released to the public, but unfortunately they didn't bring forward any new leads in this case as well. A facial reconstruction of what the boy probably looked like when he was alive was made, and it was released to the public, again in the hopes that someone would come forward and recognize him. So I'll put that picture on the screen now. The police were just really stuck. Like I said at the start of the investigation, they thought that they would be able to identify this boy pretty quickly. However, this was proving to be very difficult because they weren't getting any information from the public really. They had nothing to go on. The crime scene where the boy was found was searched several times for more clues, but apart from the few items of clothing that they found, there was nothing. And of course it was 1957, so there was no chance of collecting any like forensic evidence from the scene. It's more than likely that if this case happened today, forensic technology would be able to identify the boy and identify his killer pretty quickly. But this was 1957, and so if the police didn't have any witnesses to the crime, then they didn't really have anything. Now, the detectives working on this case discovered that this cardboard box that the boy was found in was sold at the J.C. Penney store, and it originally contained a bassinet, which is like a cradle bed for babies. A shipping label that was on the box showed that it was once sent from Peru to Indiana before arriving at the J.C. Penney store. And the detectives realized that this bassinet was one of 12 that was on sale in a J.C. Penney store in Upper Darby in Pennsylvania. They were around $7.50 each, and the last one was sold on the 16th of February 1957, so about a week before the boy's body was found. So the police went to this J.C. Penney store where this box was from to see if they kept records of everyone who purchased a bassinet. But unfortunately they didn't, and also everyone who did buy one paid with cash. They had a cash only policy, I think. So instead the cardboard box was sent to be analysed by FBI technicians to see if they could find any like useful fingerprints on it, but they couldn't really. So they couldn't really get any clues from the cardboard box, and so the detectives went back to the blue cap that was found near the crime scene, and they noticed that there was a label inside this blue cap showing where it was brought from. It was from Robbins Bald Eagle Hat and Cap Company, and the owner of this store was a woman named Hannah Robbins. Hannah said that this cap was one of 12 that was sold, and she claimed that she remembered actually selling this specific hat that was found at the crime scene. Hannah remembered that the man who purchased this exact blue cap returned a little while after he bought it to ask if another leather strap could be sewn onto the back of it. So Hannah knew that it was this specific cap because it had another leather strap sewn into it that this guy requested. Hannah said that the man who brought this cap was in his late 20s, he had blonde hair, and he looked quite similar to the pictures of the boy in the box. So maybe he was this boy's father or another relative of his. However, unfortunately, just like with the bassinet, no record of this man was ever taken, so Hannah didn't know his name or his address or any of his information. Next, the police decided to look at the blanket that the boy was wrapped in, and they found that this blanket had been cut into two separate parts and a section of the blanket was missing. It had also recently been washed before the boy was wrapped in it, so maybe someone was trying to get rid of any fingerprints that were on it before. Detectives also found that this type of blanket had been mass produced, so there was probably thousands of them, meaning that it would have been virtually impossible for detectives to trace where this exact blanket was from and where it was sold from. And when it was sent off for analysis, no surprise, this didn't bring forward any clues. Every single lead that the police had in this case had been looked into, and they all just resulted in dead ends. They had tried so hard to to identify this boy, but there was just no luck, and eventually 5 months after his body was found, he was buried and laid to rest. The inscription on his headstone read, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." But then, years and years after he was buried, in 1998, his body was exhumed because investigators hoped that they could now extract some DNA from his remains. They tried a few times to collect some DNA from the child's body, but these attempts were unsuccessful. That was until 2001 when they finally managed to gather some usable DNA from the child's teeth, and they've kept this DNA in the hopes that they would one day be able to identify this little boy. After they had collected his DNA, the boy was reburied at the Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, and the grave still actually has visitors to this day. A lot of people leave flowers and teddies and toys by his headstone. Now, despite this case going cold, there were actually quite a few theories regarding who this boy was and who killed him, which I'm going to talk about now, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts and opinions on these theories in the comments. The first theory is that the boy in the box was from a local foster home. In the year 1960, a few years after the boy's body was discovered, a man named Remington Bristow became very determined to solve this case. Bristow was an employee at the medical examiner's office, and when he decided that he wanted to try and solve this case, he contacted a psychic named Florence Sternfield. So he met with this psychic Florence to see if she could try and use her powers, I don't know, psychic abilities to work out where this boy was from, who he was, who killed him and stuff like that. And Florence did actually come up with something, and she told Bristow that the boy in the box was from an old, large house in the area, and eventually this house that she described matched the description of an old local foster home, which was located about 1.5 miles away from where the boy in the box was discovered. And Florence said that he used to live here. He used to live in this foster home. So the police decided to go and check out this foster home, even though they didn't really have any evidence linking the boy to this foster home at all. But at this point, they had nothing to go on, so they were literally looking into anything. So they went to look at this foster home, which was owned by married couple Arthur and Catherine Nicoletti. Catherine had a daughter from a previous marriage, and she was named Anna Marie, and all three of them lived in this house, and together they ran a foster home where they would take in children from the state. And so it was theorized that maybe the boy in the box stayed in this foster home and the Nicoletti family had something to do with his death. The police did investigate this theory, but eventually they just kind of stopped because they didn't have any evidence to say the boy even lived there, let alone was murdered by the family. But Remington Bristow was not letting this go. He was convinced that the psychic was right and that the boy in the box lived in this foster home and that the Nicoletti family had something to do with his death. Especially because he took Florence, the psychic, who was from New Jersey, he took her to the spot where the boy in the box was discovered, and she walked straight to the foster home, having never been to Philadelphia before. And so he was absolutely certain that his theory was correct. He thought that he had cracked this case. Anyway, the year following this, in 1961, the Nicoletti family decided to put their foster home up for sale because they didn't want to live there anymore. And so whilst the property was up for sale, Remington Bristow decided to go and view it because, you know, when houses go up for sale, they do like house viewings. So he went inside the home and he began looking around. He was kind of like investigating it, and whilst he was walking around, he came across a white bassinet which appeared to be identical to the one that would have come in the cardboard box that the boy was found in from the J.C. Penney store. He also found some blankets in the home which again appeared to be very similar to the blanket that the boy was wrapped in. I mean, this could have just been a coincidence, you know, this was a foster home, they needed bassinets and they needed blankets for the children that were staying there, but the fact that they were very similar to the blanket and bassinet that were involved in the boy in the box case is very strange, I think. But it's not really evidence at all to say that the boy in the box and the foster home were linked, although Bristow thought that it was, and he was convinced now more than ever that the Nicolettis had something to do with this boy's death. Bristow's theory was that the boy in the box was actually the son of Catherine's daughter, Anna Marie. However, Anna Marie wasn't married. I'm not quite sure how old she was, but I believe she was quite young, and she wasn't married, and obviously around this time it was very frowned upon to have a child out of wedlock. So Bristow believes that Anna Marie's stepfather, Arthur Nicoletti, decided to get rid of this child so that he wouldn't bring any shame onto the family. And to get rid of this little boy, Arthur Nicoletti murdered him and wrapped up his body and put him inside this cardboard box. But in the end, this theory just couldn't be proven. All of the evidence linking the Nicoletti family to the crime was literally circumstantial. If you can even call it evidence, there was nothing concrete connecting the Nicoletti family and the boy in the box. Although what's interesting is that Bristow then reached out to Arthur Nicoletti and said, okay, well, will you do a lie detector test if you are innocent? And he refused. He didn't want to do one. In 1993, Remington Bristow actually passed away, and then 5 years later, in 1998, the investigation into the boy in the box case was reopened. If you remember, that was the year that his body was exhumed, and a couple years after that, DNA was successfully collected from his teeth. So the investigation was reopened, and one of the detectives decided to revisit the foster home theory, because even though there wasn't really any evidence, this was always a big theory in this case, and at the time one of the only theories. So after all these years, this detective decided to go and question the Nicoletti family once again, although by this point Catherine Nicoletti, so Arthur's wife, had actually passed away. I don't know exactly when or how she died, but when she did, her daughter Anna Marie actually married her husband Arthur. So Arthur married his stepdaughter Anna Marie after his wife Catherine passed away. Anyway, this detective questioned Arthur Nicoletti and his new wife Anna Marie about the boy in the box, and I couldn't actually find much information about this interview, but apparently the detective left that interview firmly believing that they did not have anything to do with this boy's murder. If you remember, Bristow's theory was that this boy was Anna Marie's son, and so now that they had DNA, they could test his DNA against Anna Marie's to see if that in fact was true. And it wasn't. She wasn't the boy's mother. Also, I believe at the time of the boy's death in 1957, there were 8 children staying at the foster home, and all of these children were apparently accounted for, and none of them were the boy in the box. So there was no evidence that the boy even lived there, let alone was murdered by the Nicoletti family, and as a result, this theory has been pretty much ruled out. The second big theory in this case, which personally I think is the theory that I believe, is known as the M theory. Basically, in the year 2002, the investigators who were working on this case were contacted by a psychiatrist from Ohio. And this psychiatrist claimed that one of her patients had some information about the boy in the box. Now, this client is pretty much only known as M. I think that her identity was protected, although I did read on just one source that she was called Martha, but I don't know if that is true because it's not, I don't think it's a very reliable source. But most sources online refer to her as just M, so I'm just going to call her M for this video. Anyway, M told her psychiatrist that the boy in the box's birth parents sold him to her mother in 1954. M said that her mother, whose name again I couldn't actually find, but she said that her mother purchased this little boy, and over the next 2 years of his life he was horrifically, physically and sexually abused by her. Until one day in February of 1957, when this little boy was eating his dinner. He ate his dinner, which was baked beans, and he was sick, and he vomited back up these baked beans in the bathtub. And Em said that this made her mother very angry, and she was in a fit of rage, and she began beating this little boy for being sick in the bathtub, and she just kept beating him, and she threw him on the floor, and eventually he died. Now, like I mentioned earlier on in the video, the coroner stated that the boy in the box was very malnourished, so he hadn't really eaten that much around the time that he died. However, he did actually have traces of baked beans in his stomach. And if you remember, his hands and his feet were also wrinkled, indicating that he had been in water either shortly before or after his death. And this little boy that Em was talking about, she said was sick in the bathtub, so maybe he was sick whilst he was having a bath, which would have obviously caused his hands and his feet to be wrinkled. And what's really, really interesting here is that at this point, when Em came forward, both these pieces of information about the baked beans in the little boy's stomach and the wrinkled hands and feet, these pieces of information hadn't been released to the public. So the only people that knew this was the coroner and the police and probably the killer or anyone who witnessed the little boy's murder. So how would Em know that unless she was there and she witnessed it? So thinking that this was a very promising lead, investigators went to go and talk to Em, and she told them all about her life and growing up with her mother. She said that her mother would often sexually abuse her, and she began telling investigators about how her mother purchased this child. And she said that when she was 10 years old, her and her mother went to a house and they knocked on the door, and this person answered, and her mother handed this person an envelope, presumably with money in it, and in exchange for this she was given a little boy. Em said that the little boy couldn't speak very well and he was mentally handicapped. She also claimed that her mother called this little boy Jonathan. However, she didn't know if this was his actual birth name or if that was just the name that her mother had given him. And like Em said, over the next few years, this little boy, or Jonathan, was treated very badly. He was horrifically abused. He didn't even have a proper bedroom. He was forced to sleep in the basement, where he had to use a floor drain as a toilet and an empty box as a bed. Em said that this little boy was just hidden away. He was never allowed out and no one knew who he was or ever saw him, which would explain why no one recognised him when the pictures of his dead body were released. And then, as we know, Em said that one day in February of 1957, her mother just completely snapped and she lost it with the little boy and she murdered him. And once he was dead, she cut his hair and then she made Em help her wrap his body in the blanket and put it in the boot or trunk of their car. They then drove around and the mother was looking for a good place to dump this body, and eventually she decided that Susquehanna Road in Fox Chase was a good enough place. And Em actually stated that whilst they were trying to dump this body, a man in a car drove past and he pulled up and he got out and asked them if they were okay, if they were having car trouble, if they needed any help. But the mother just kind of stood in front of their car's license plate so that he couldn't see it, and she just politely said, "No, we're fine, thank you." And the guy got back in his car and he drove away. But anyway, going back to what Em said about the disposal of this little boy's body, she claimed that once the man in the car had driven away, her mother got the little boy's body, or Jonathan's body, out of the boot of her car, and nearby she found a discarded cardboard box, and she decided to put the little boy's body in this cardboard box to kind of hide him. And then they just left him there, they left the scene, and eventually he would be found. So that was Em's version of events, and a lot of things that she said about the murder and the disposal of the body lined up pretty perfectly with the evidence. She knew quite a lot about the boy in the box, information that had not been released to the public at this point. So unless she was there and unless she witnessed it, how did she know this information? I don't know why it took her so long to come forward. However, given how abusive her mother was, I'm guessing that she was just absolutely terrified to tell anyone. And I believe when she did eventually come forward, her mother was dead. But anyway, the police began investigating M's story, and they spent around 6 months trying to prove her version of events, but they couldn't really. They apparently had no concrete or solid evidence to suggest that she was telling the truth, which I find really strange considering how accurate her details were. Also, the police apparently spoke to M and her mother's neighbours who lived next door to them at the time of this case taking place in 1957, and they said that there were never any children in that house apart from M. So basically they were saying that M was lying and that there was never another child in that house and that M's mother never purchased another child. But going back to what I said earlier, M said that this little boy, or Jonathan as her mother called him, was never let out of the basement. So how would they even know that he existed if he wasn't allowed out? The police also looked into M's background and they found that she had a history of mental illness, and so they thought that she therefore wasn't reliable and her story couldn't be trusted, and so this entire theory was pretty much just ruled out, which seems so stupid to me. I think that this is a really promising lead and that there is evidence to back up this theory, but like I said, they just dismissed it. And the final theory that I came across whilst researching this case was that maybe the boy in the box was a boy named Stephen Greg Damman. Now, Stephen was just under 3 years old when he was abducted from a supermarket in Long Island in New York on the 31st of October 1955, so 2 years before the boy in the box was found. Stephen's kidnapper was never found and neither was Stephen, but when the boy in the box was discovered, it was theorised that maybe he was Stephen, because he would have been around the same age as the boy in the box and they did look quite similar. However, investigators compared medical records and x-rays of both boys, I believe, and no matches were found. And years later, with the advances in DNA and forensic technology, investigators took Stephen's sister's DNA and they tested it against the boy in the box's DNA and it wasn't a match, so this wasn't Stephen. And sadly, I believe that Stephen's case has never been solved to this day. I don't think he has ever been found. I also read a theory online that maybe the boy in the box was actually raised as a girl because he did have quite long blonde hair before it was cut, because if you remember, someone had attempted to cut it probably after his death and his hair was still clinging to his body. So it's theorized that maybe he was raised as a girl and then when he was murdered, the killer cut his hair to try and disguise him. But I couldn't really find much more information on that theory, so I don't know if the police ever looked into it. But over the years there have been multiple theories in this case. I've just kind of talked about the main ones, but none of them have been proven. I personally believe the M theory. I think that M was telling the truth and that so many things that she said lined up perfectly with the evidence. I just feel like the police should have looked into this lead more. I don't really know what is going on with this case today. I hope that people are still looking into it, but I do know that in March of 2016, the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children released their own facial reconstruction of what they believed the boy probably looked like when he was alive. So I'll put that on screen now. They have added him to their database, so we can only hope that one day this flags up a match. In August of 2018, a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter, who used a DNA profiling technique to help investigators identify the Golden State Killer, said that she was going to try and use the same technique, the same method to identify the boy in the box, but I couldn't actually find any more information on that. I don't know if she is still trying to do this because obviously this was only in 2018, so she may well still be trying today. But that is pretty much it for this case. Like I said earlier, the boy was reburied in Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, and his headstone has the words "America's Unknown Child" on it, because that is what he is known as well as the boy in the box. And people still to this day leave flowers and toys on his grave. And yeah, that is the end of this case. A really sad one. I can only hope that one day this poor little boy gets his name back. Please do let me know in the comments what you think about this case. Do you believe the M theory like I do, or do you believe the foster home theory, or do you believe something else happened to the boy? Quickly before I go, I just want to give a special shout out to the members of my Patreon page. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else wants to become a member of our little Patreon family, then the link is always in the description of my videos. I would really appreciate it if you could give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye guys.